Hey there, horror fans! Today I've got a spine-chilling tale that'll make you think twice about your friendly neighbors. This is the story of Ellie Ross and the vanishing neighbor. Let's dive in. Ellie Ross had just moved into her new apartment. It was small, cozy, but a bit outdated. She was busy unpacking when there was a knock at the door, much too soon for a visitor. Ellie frowned. "Who the?" she muttered. Opening the door, she found an elderly lady, Mrs. Holloway, standing there with a warm smile and a plate of cookies. "New neighbors should feel welcome," Mrs. Holloway said warmly. "I'm Mrs. Holloway, right across the hall." Ellie felt relieved and smiled back. "Oh, thanks. I'm Ellie." Mrs. Holloway studied her, just a bit too long. "You look like you belong here," she said. Ellie laughed awkwardly. Thanks?" As Mrs. Holloway turned to leave, the lights flickered. Fast forward to that night. Ellie was working on her laptop when she heard a rhythmic tap-tap-tap through the wall. Frustrated, she pressed her ear to the wall. Silence, then soft, muffled words. "Are you still there?" Mrs. Holloway's voice echoed through the wall. Ellie jumped back, startled. There was a knock at her front door. Ellie hesitated, her heart pounding. She reached for the doorknob, but something made her stop. What if it wasn't Mrs. Holloway? What if it was something else entirely? To be continued. Ellie decided to investigate the strange occurrences. She started by asking other neighbors about Mrs. Holloway. Most of them seemed puzzled, claiming they had never seen or heard of her. This only deepened the mystery. Ellie then found an old newspaper article about a woman named Mrs. Holloway who had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. The more she dug, the more eerie coincidences she found. One night she decided to confront the source of the tapping. Armed with a flashlight, she ventured into the basement where the noise seemed to originate. The air was thick with tension as she descended the creaky stairs. Suddenly the lights went out, and she was plunged into darkness. Ellie's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone. Just as she turned on the flashlight, she saw a shadow move in the corner of her eye. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The tapping started again, louder and more insistent. She followed the sound to an old locked door. With trembling hands, she found a key hanging nearby and unlocked the door. Inside, she found a small, dusty room with old furniture and a single, flickering light bulb. In the center of the room was a diary. Ellie picked it up and started reading. The diary belonged to Mrs. Holloway and detailed her descent into madness after her husband's mysterious disappearance. The last entry was particularly chilling. "He's still here, watching, waiting." Ellie felt a cold breath on her neck and turned around to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was Mrs. Holloway, but her eyes were empty and her face twisted in a grotesque smile. Ellie screamed and dropped the diary. The figure lunged at her and everything went black. When Ellie woke up, she was back in her apartment, the diary on her lap. She looked around, but there was no sign of Mrs. Holloway. Had it all been a dream? She wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. She was never going back to that basement again. Ellie couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences continued. She would hear whispers in the middle of the night, see shadows moving out of the corner of her eye, and feel a cold presence in her apartment. Desperate for answers, she reached out to a paranormal investigator. The investigator, Mr. Connors, arrived with his equipment and set up cameras and sensors around the apartment. As night fell, they sat in the living room, waiting for any signs of activity. Hours passed with nothing unusual happening. Just as they were about to call it a night, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. The sensors started beeping, and the cameras picked up a faint, ghostly figure moving towards them. Mr. Connors tried to communicate with the spirit, asking it to reveal its identity. The figure stopped and pointed towards the basement. Ellie and Mr. Connors exchanged a nervous glance but decided to follow the lead. They descended into the basement, the air growing colder with each step. The figure led them to the same locked door Ellie had found before. This time the door was ajar, Inside, they found a hidden passageway leading to an underground tunnel. The walls were lined with old photographs and newspaper clippings about missing people, including Mrs. Holloway's husband. At the end of the tunnel, they found a small, hidden room. In the center of the room was a makeshift altar with candles and strange symbols drawn on the walls. On the altar was a photograph of Ellie. Suddenly, the candles flickered, and the ghostly figure appeared again. It was Mrs. Holloway, but she looked different, more human. She spoke in a soft, sorrowful voice, explaining that she had been trapped in the apartment for years, unable to move on because of the dark energy in the basement. She begged Ellie and Mr. Connors to help her break the curse. They agreed and performed a cleansing ritual, burning sage and reciting prayers. As they finished, the room filled with a bright light, and Mrs. Holloway's spirit was finally freed. Ellie felt a sense of relief wash over her. The strange occurrences stopped, and she was finally able to live in peace. She never forgot Mrs. Holloway and the chilling tale of the disappearing neighbor. But the story doesn't end there. A week later, Ellie received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of Mrs. Holloway, smiling warmly, with a note on the back that read, "Thank you for setting me free." Ellie knew that while the haunting had ended, the memory of Mrs. Holloway's tragic tale would stay with her forever, reminding her of the thin veil between the living and the dead. The town was abuzz with rumors of a mysterious stranger who had recently moved in. No one knew where he came from or what his intentions were, but his presence was felt by all. The stranger kept to himself, rarely seen outside his home, but strange occurrences began to unfold in the neighborhood. People reported seeing shadows moving in the night, and eerie sounds echoed through the streets. The townsfolk grew increasingly uneasy, and whispers of the stranger's dark past began to circulate. As the days passed, the tension in the town reached a boiling point, and the truth about the mysterious stranger was finally revealed. One evening, Ellie received an unexpected visitor. It was the stranger himself, standing at her doorstep. He introduced himself as Thomas and explained that he had been drawn to the town by the same dark energy that had trapped Mrs. Holloway. He revealed that he was a guardian, capable of sensing and dispelling malevolent forces. Thomas had come to ensure that the curse was truly broken and to protect the town from any lingering darkness. Ellie, skeptical but intrigued, invited him in. Together they revisited the basement, where Thomas performed a final powerful ritual to cleanse the area completely. As the ritual concluded, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and a sense of calm returned to the town. The mysterious stranger, now known to be a protector, left as quietly as he had arrived, leaving the townsfolk with a renewed sense of safety and gratitude. Ellie, forever changed by her experiences, realized that the thin veil between the living and the dead was not just a source of fear, but also a realm where guardians like Thomas existed to protect and guide. And so, the tale of the disappearing neighbor, the chilling basement revelation, and the final farewell was complete, with the mysterious stranger ensuring that the town would remain at peace. As the mysterious stranger revealed his true identity, the town was thrown into disarray. Thomas was not just a guardian, he was a former detective who had gone rogue, driven by a personal vendetta. His presence in the town was no coincidence. He had been tracking a dangerous criminal who had evaded capture for years. The trail of this elusive foe had led him to their quiet community. The townsfolk, initially wary, soon realized that Thomas's arrival was a stroke of fate. He was not a harbinger of doom, but a beacon of hope. With his help, they began to peel back layers of deceit and corruption that had long festered in the shadows of their town. Evidence of a hidden network of crime began to surface, implicating individuals they had thought trustworthy. The town's collective shock turned into a unified resolve for justice. Thomas's quest became their own, and together they formed an unbreakable alliance. Late one night, under the cover of darkness, Thomas led a group of determined townsfolk to a secluded spot on the outskirts of town. There, Hidden beneath an old abandoned barn, they discovered a secret hideout, evidence of the criminals' operations. With this newfound knowledge, the townsfolk and Thomas devised a plan to finally corner the criminal. The final confrontation was near, and the town held its breath, anxious yet hopeful, ready to reclaim their peace. As dawn broke, the stage was set for the ultimate showdown. Thomas, backed by the courageous townsfolk, prepared to face the darkness one last time. The hidden truth was now in the open, and the town stood united, ready to reclaim their future. With the evidence in hand and a plan in place, the townsfolk and Thomas braced themselves for the final confrontation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, a tense silence filled the air. Under the cloak of night, Thomas and the determined townsfolk made their way to the criminal's hideout. The old abandoned barn loomed ahead, its decrepit structure a stark reminder of the darkness they were about to face. Inside, the criminal and his cohorts were unaware of the storm about to descend upon them. Thomas signaled the townsfolk to surround the barn, each person taking their position with steely resolve. The air was thick with anticipation, hearts pounding in unison. At Thomas's command, the townsfolk moved as one, bursting into the barn with a force that took the criminals by surprise. The ensuing battle was a clash of wits and wills. Thomas, with his unmatched skill and determination, outmaneuvered the criminal at every turn. The townsfolk, fueled by their collective resolve for justice, fought bravely alongside him. The criminal, realizing he was cornered, made a desperate attempt to escape, but it was in vain. Thomas's years of training and experience culminated in this moment, and he was relentless. Finally, with a swift and decisive move, Thomas apprehended the criminal. The tension that had gripped the town for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of overwhelming relief. The townsfolk erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the night. As dawn broke, the town gathered to witness the criminal being taken away. Thomas stood among them, his mission accomplished. The townsfolk, their faces etched with gratitude, bid him farewell. They knew their lives had been forever changed by his presence. Thomas's legacy lived on, a testament to the power of justice and the resilience of the human spirit. The town, once shrouded in darkness, now stood united in the light, ready to face whatever the future held.